Hi, everyone. This is the Hungry Math Professor here, and welcome to my channel. Today, we're going to be discussing Forbidden Notebook by Alba de Cespedes. Um, I really enjoyed this novel as well. This was published in 1952 in Italian, and it was written by Alba de Cespedes. She's a Cuban Italian writer. And then this was translated to English in 2023 by Anne Goldstein, which is a giant jump in time, right? Between 1952 when the book was published to it's just translated into English in 2023, which is quite surprising after reading the book because I think it's a book that would do really well. Um, so we can talk about all the various reasons why that may have been. I'll let you look that up, but I'm not going to discuss that too much, just to bring up how surprising that is, um, in some sense. What's interesting here is this is written as a series of diary entries by the main character. I'll get into the characters in a second. But what's interesting is that this was originally released day by day, actually between December 1950 and June 1951, which is also where the um the dates that occur in the book as well. And so it was originally released sort of, day by day, diary entries to some degree, and then it was later packaged in the book form. And this is just a really interesting way to read and see inside the character's life. It feels at times like we are this character's therapist, and we're just seeing inside her inner life constantly, and we get to sort of analyze what's going on and put together pieces that maybe the character's not always putting together herself. And it's just a really interesting exploration of, yeah, of the inner life. Um, in the book, it's 1952 in Italy, and it's post World War II, and post 20 years of Mussolini and fascism. So there's some of that occurs in the book, though I will say I don't know if this is just because of the translation or what, but I would say that there's not a lot here that feels distinctly Italian to me. So much of it feels like it transcends any one particular country or culture. Of course, there are references in the book that are specific to Italy, so don't get me wrong, but it just feels like what's going on in this book transcends that and is really about families, and it's about gender dynamics, and I'll get into more of what it's about, but I really feel like there's something universally human here. And of course there are some references to Italian things, but it also feels like this could have been, written about the American family in the 1950s or something like that as well. Of course, there's differences in the details between these things, but there are some universal things that are the same. So that makes the book very interesting to me as well. And I want to just read this quote. This is not, this was a quote that's included in the book, but it's not a quote by the author. This is a quote by Ramon de la Cruz. And it quote says, Senor Don Blas, from what book did you take this text? From the theater of human life, which is where I read. I like this because I think of this as like a reflection on the novel. Like, what is a novel about? I think so often we think of a novel or it's fiction, right? It's not real. But I think that fiction can be so much realer sometimes, right? It all hinges on what we mean by real here. But I think even though fiction is not necessarily recounting facts that actually happened, I think that it is coming from the theater of life, these ideas, and although those they didn't actually happen, they are capturing and communicating, um, some really real things about human life. And if you start to think about the books that I tend to find really interesting, the ones I've done on my channel so far, I think for me, I always love a book that uncovers something uncomfortable about life and forces us to look at it and reflect on it. And that's exactly what this book does. And I always enjoy that. And there's something uncomfortable about that, but I think for me, like, we have to look at these things. We have to reflect on them. We have to analyze them, and we have to think about them. And, you know, maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe not everybody has to do that, but at least for me, that's something I find really enjoyable. And I think that's why I really enjoyed this book, because it's just this like, you know, analysis of the inner life of this person, this mother, and the interaction with all these different characters in her life. And it's just this like just analysis of people and how they interact with each other, um, which I really enjoy. So, you know, the name of the book is called Forbidden Notebook. Um, in the beginning, we see the main character, Valeria. Um, by the way, I'm going to just pronounce these words maybe not the right way in Italian. The names are all definitely Italian. So feel free to correct me at times, um, or forgive me for my mispronunciations and probably in all my videos so far. But you know, in the first scene when she buys the notebook, it's forbidden in the strict sense that this particular store that sells tobacco by law is not allowed to sell notebooks on Sundays, which is an interesting like literary device because okay, that means she could have bought it on a Monday, right, or something like that, but she was there on a Sunday, and it serves the role to make the book forbidden from the very beginning. So she buys this note, but the tobacconist is willing to sell it to her anyway. He just tells her to like hide it under her jacket or something, right? And so from the very beginning, this main character is in secrecy about this notebook, and she brings it home and she immediately hides it from her family, right? So the book is about this family. The mother, Valeria, who's the character that we see inside her inner life, she's the one writing the diary day to day, and we read her diary entries. And her husband, Michael, and their daughter Morella and their son Ricardo. So that's the four main characters that most of the book is focused on those four, and then there's some minor characters. There's Valeria's mother and father. We don't really see her father, but we do see her mother from time to time. And then there's some other characters I'll bring up along the way, but for the most part the book is about this mother, her husband, her daughter, and her son. And it's this, it's a commentary on gender roles in that time in Italy. But that's the part I think also that transcends. I think it can be a commentary on just gender roles in general and how women were just expected to be mothers and were expected to take on so many roles in the house by default without any sort of discussion. And so much of the book is trying to analyze the different female characters and the way that they see themselves, the way that they've been kind of forced into certain roles in society and in the family and in relationships, and what that does to them as characters and how that affects the way they interact with each other. So much of the book is about that. But throughout the book, Valeria is constantly worried about the notebook being discovered from the very beginning. So many of the diary entries involve at least a short reflection on like, how am I going to get away with this? Where am I going to hide to write? Because they live in a very small apartment. This is a poor family in Italy. Like they're constantly making it by, so they're not like homeless, but they are, they're barely making it by, right? They're constantly worried about how they're going to make the next, round of bills and things like that. So they live in a very small apartment, and so there's not a lot of room to just write by yourself. So sometimes she locks herself in the bathroom. Sometimes she just stays up late in the kitchen and hopes nobody comes in. But she's constantly worried about being discovered. She feels that if she tells her family that she has this notebook, they're going to make fun of her. And it seems that she has every right to think that because, there's several scenes where she gets made fun of by these people in her family for just like having her own ideas or having her own feelings about things. So she really seems to be justified in worrying that they're going to make fun of her. Though at times it's hard not to feel like, man, maybe, maybe if you did tell them, wouldn't be so bad. It's hard to say. But I think she's constantly worried about it. But at the same time, it feels like you say, okay, this is producing a lot of anxiety in your life. Like maybe you don't want this notebook anymore. But I also get the feeling, you get the feeling that it's creating a lot of excitement for her as well. So there's this tension between like the excitement that this book, having this notebook brings, but also the anxiety and the worry that it brings. And it's hard to tease apart these two things. But also this notebook represents a place that this character has to express herself, to be honest, to just say what's going on in her head. And it's so clear that she needs that, and she's not getting that from her husband or the rest of her family or her mother. She constantly feels misunderstood by these characters, and the notebook is the only place that she has to like really truly um, express herself. So, again, it's throughout the book we're just studying the inner life of this main character and trying to make connections about her family. Sometimes it doesn't feel like Valeria is making these connections herself, but it's kind of fun as the reader to make these connections about the family, even if Valeria is not, doesn't seem to be so aware of it herself at times. But also because Valeria keeps writing in this diary every night, I can't help but think that her subconscious is making connections as well, right? Even if she doesn't explicitly write them in the book, the fact that she's writing this down is causing her to reflect, and then that reflection reflects, and it just keeps building on itself. So as the book goes on, it feels clear that Valeria is like getting more insight about herself and her family, even if not always so explicitly. It's clearly making an impact on how she understands herself and her family. And again, we get to make the connections as well. And so another part that's interesting is you can analyze the book by breaking it down into the various different interactions between characters. I won't go through every single interaction. I think you can analyze every single one, meaning like, Morella and her mother. You can analyze that interaction. You can analyze Morella and her husband. Valeria and her mom, or Valeria and her daughter. But, we can go through every single pair of these characters and try to analyze them. But I won't do every single one. But there's some pretty important ones. In particularly, there's Valeria and her daughter Morella. This is a very important um, one because the book is about gender roles, and it's about sort of how females in this society, but also in many societies and still today, are expected to do certain things that they maybe don't have the choice about. But what's also interesting here is that in the book, we see that between the two generations, or between the three generations, right? The mother of Valeria, and her daughter Morella, that there is a difference in how they see their gender roles and how they see themselves in society. Part of this is because society is changing as well. And so there's this tension between Valeria and Morella because, for two things. For one, it seems like the society's view of what a woman's role is changing and evolving. So so Morella gets the a little bit of the advantage of this sort of new openness to what a woman's role can be. But also, I think there's this tension because it becomes clear that Morella is just a more intelligent person generally, and she has it seems like a much richer inner life that she's much more aware of and able to reflect on. And it just feels like even though Morella is much younger than her mother, she like already seems to have a much deeper understanding of people, of herself. And she's really intelligent. She gets through law school eventually and gets this job. So we get this sense that there's also this tension between the fact that Morella just has a much deeper understanding of things, and so at times it's like, well, maybe she's just young and really bold about her beliefs and things like that. But the way I read this, it's really that Morella is more intelligent and more reflective and more insightful than her mother. And that creates a lot of tension because as the mother, you want to be the one that has the wisdom. You want to be listened to. You want to be respected. And it's hard to deal with the fact that maybe your daughter just knows more than you do, even though she's a lot younger, right? Like it's hard to deal with the fact that maybe this person really is, um, just more insightful than you are. And so much of the book for me is a study of the fact that, like, of the family. It's just a study of the family for me in so many ways. In a family, we are like genetically related to each other, so we're going to have similarities, but we might have these big differences that make it really hard for us to understand each other. And you see that throughout the different characters in the book. I just want to read a few quotes related to this. So here we see Valeria reflecting on her daughter. Her constant reflecting scares me and especially inspires pity. It's pointless to think so much. The days take their course regardless, indifferent. Morella seems trapped in a cruel machine that will crush her. So here you see Valeria like worried about her daughter, and she's worried because her daughter just she thinks too much. She tries to understand things too much, and why is Morella doing this? And she points it in this like very negative way, but it's not clear that I mean I don't think Morella would describe it that way. I think, for Morella, there's this kind of rich inner life, and it's not something she can turn off. But her mother's worried about it, right? Her mother doesn't understand it, so that causes her to worry. But also, I think she's worried because she feels like that women shouldn't are not able to think that much in society, and they get in trouble for sort of thinking that much. So that I think that's a part of it. But I also think there's this resentment or this jealousy of her daughter's boldness and her daughter's strength and ability to think this way. Um, in on 185, this is a discussion between Michael and Valeria about Morella. And so this is Michael's talking. He says, Morella can explain these things better than I can, he continued. She feels them more acutely because she's younger. So many facts, so many new conditions have dug an abyss between Morella's generation and mine. Maybe to fill it through love. Maybe it's hard for you to understand Morella because he hesitated, and I encouraged him to go on. Because I'm 20 years older than she is, you mean? No, he responded, because a mother can't admit that many things in which she believed no longer count for her daughter and other new things. So again, in this quote, you see the tension between a few things. First of all, both Michael and Valeria feel like they don't quite understand Morella, and that's probably because of just the difference in generations and the change in the society and how things are being seen, but also specifically between Valeria and Morella, that they're both women. They're both faced with this reality that is forced upon them, but it's different for Valeria than it is for Morella. But oftentimes Valeria is not able to accept the fact that it's different. She's not open enough to the fact that perhaps Morella is not experiencing the same exact things that I did. Yes, they're probably related, and Morella can learn from me, but I can't expect that Morella is experiencing exactly the same things that I did because she's not, right? And it's hard, I think, for Valeria and the rest of the characters to accept the fact that these things are different. You also see this play out between Valeria and her mother, right? That they both don't seem to understand each other either. They're both not willing to accept that maybe our experience of life is just different. That yeah, there are similarities that we can talk about and we can learn from, but somehow it just doesn't feel like they're willing to accept the fact that their lives are slightly different, right? And they had different experiences, and they're just not open to that. And it just reminds me so much of how I think just families are in general. Like we just project ourselves onto everyone around us so often, and we forget that we're not the same, and we need to listen to how those other people in our life are experiencing life differently and try to understand what that might feel like for them. And it's not exactly the same as it feels for us. So another big thing that happens in the book is that Valeria has this boss at work. So Valeria has to work because the family is poor, and her husband's salary, Michael's salary, is not enough to cover the expenses. So she goes to work, and this is like a scandalous thing in the culture at the time. There's a few things, first of all, the woman's supposed to not work and she's supposed to take care of the house and things like that. But also, I think there's this like worry that Michael's going to feel threatened by this, and that's not right in society. And it's just a sign of their, the fact that they're poor, that she has to work. And so there's lots that they're embarrassed about because of that. But at the same time, Michael and Valeria seem to have accepted this to some degree, and it's just a part of what they need to do. Like Valeria needs to work in order to live. But this brings up an extra issue because that means she has to work, and but she also is expected to still play the role that a woman's supposed to play in the home. So that means she really has too many things to do, right? If she just had to do one or the other, maybe that's a reasonable ask. But to ask her to do both is unreasonable, and society hasn't like progressed enough to start to sort of even out these roles a little bit in the family. Um, so she's constantly just overworked. And it's funny because the characters in her life can notice that she's overworked and try to, take it easy, take some time off. But they don't really ever seem to take that issue seriously enough to actually solve the problem. They see it from time to time and they suggest things that could help, but um, they don't really seem to take it seriously enough to actually solve it, right? But there's this affair. Well, it's an emotional affair between Valeria and her boss Guido. And we constantly see her writing about Guido in in her diary because this is the only character in her life that makes her feel seen, that makes her feel understood, that makes her feel safe. And it's not that she's like physically unsafe in the family or anything like that. It's just she's never feels like emotionally satisfied by her husband or her kids or her mother. And so this boss at work is someone she can confide in. And also he also gets the same thing from her. So it's funny because the book almost never talks about sex, which is, this is a book where you could easily talk a lot about sex at different points in this book. I don't know if it's because it was like really taboo to talk about sex at the time and it just wasn't worth it in a book like this that was revolutionary in so many other ways, or if it was an intentional thing. I don't know. I'm just kind of, doing my own reflection on what that could be about. But I will say I actually think it's a really good idea that they talk so little about sex, only because that brings the focus on the sort of emotional intimacy that's missing. And it's not about this raw physical experience. It's about the emotional intimacy that's missing in so many of these relationships, in particular in Valeria and her husband, Valeria and her mom, and Valeria and her kids. So there's this emotional affair with her boss, and it's funny because so often her boss and her go to work on Saturday and they just work next to each other, and then maybe they share a few things about their life, right? It's such a small interaction in some sense, but because of how hungry they are for that emotional connection, just that little bit of interaction with this person can feel so significant to them, right? And so many of their interactions feel like not so significant, but you get to see this emotional affair kind of progress throughout the book, right? And at some point, they're being more explicit about it. They're like walking hand in hand outdoors, this kind of thing. Or he's dropping her off at their place, but then at the end, they start talking about going on a trip together. And this represents like this other life that Valeria could have had in some sense. Like, it represents a different path that she didn't get to take. And she's constantly wrestling with that. But it's also this hope that Valeria and Guido have to kind of escape this life that makes them feel so emotionally trapped. And they just want to get out. They want to just live. They want to be able to have freedom. Like Valeria wants to be able to just have freedom and do what I want. I don't want to always just be a slave to my husband and my kids and whatever they need, and my mother or whatever. I'm so tired of just being pulled in so many different directions and forced to be this person that is not necessarily who I want to be. And the tragedy of it though is that they never get to go on this trip, and it becomes clear at some point that Valeria says it out loud that we're never going to go on this trip, right? And because the reality that's forcing them to feel this lack of emotional intimacy is not going to go away. And then this comes to a head because her son, who is often like seen as this like very simple, maybe not super intelligent person who um even though maybe society is progressing a little bit in how they see women, it's clear that Ricardo wants to live in that sort of old dynamic. And so he picks a wife who can play that role, even though, so his wife, Marina, is the same, roughly around the age of Morella, but Marina is a completely different person. She's much simpler, she's quieter, She's not the kind of person that's trying to rustle any feathers. And she's happy, or I don't know if she's happy to, but she is willing to play that like typical gender role again for Ricardo. And that's what Ricardo wants. You get the sense that Ricardo is like a very, um, that he's yeah, just not a strong enough character to be with someone like Morella, or to, allow these gender roles to change. He wants to cling to something old. But the tragedy that happens is that Ricardo gets Marina pregnant, and now this is what ultimately holds Valeria back from going on this trip with Guido. And so they never really have this trip that they want, that would be so like empowering for Valeria and for both of them, because her son has this kid, and now they have to rearrange their lives. Valeria and Michael have to rearrange their lives in order to now help their son, and now their soon to be daughter-in-law, take care of this kid, because they don't have enough money, um, and they don't have anywhere to go. And so it's like one more piece of the puzzle that's holding Valeria back from being who she wants to be, and just expressing herself and having this emotional intimacy. It's just like one more nail in the coffin, for her, brought in by her own son, right? And you constantly see how Morella is just doesn't really care for Marina. It's interesting because sorry, I keep saying Morella. Valeria doesn't really care for Marina. Um, she seems maybe jealous of Marina sometimes. She talks about how Marina is so simple, but in some sense, I think Valeria sees a reflection of herself in Marina. I mean, they're not the same person, but so there's some sense in which she's just embarrassed maybe by who she sees in Marina. It's like a look into who she was, when she was that age. Though she also points out how they were different. But the question is like, how different were they really, or are we just seeing like a different reflection of who she became at that time? So often in the book, Valeria reflects on her relationship with Michael, like early on, and how in love with each other they were, but also there's this sense in which there was like no choice there for Valeria in what to happen, right? And also because they're just kind of like poorer, so they don't have choice for that reason, but also because Valerie's a woman in this society that just says that, there's this very specific path for women, and you just find that husband, and you get married to them, and you do what they need, and this kind of thing. So she's constantly reflecting on like what was really going on there. Like we were in love, but did we really know what we were in love for, or did we really understand the choices we were making? And now she gets to reflect on her son Ricardo and Marina doing not exactly the same thing, but a very similar thing with their lives. And it's like this uncomfortable reflection of like, is that what we did too? Like, did we just kind of do something like that? And was that real? It's not sustaining us now. And so I've been talking about this maybe too much, but so towards the end of the book, you feel like Valeria is making some real progress in understanding herself and her role in the family, but also just so fed up with the fact that she constantly has to give up herself. And towards the end, it becomes clear that she's going to have to stop writing in this notebook. Like, yeah, it's been something, it's been like very empowering for her to write in this notebook, to feel these things and to have a place to express them, but it's also like super uncomfortable, and it's like emotionally draining as well. And it's time to, she feels like it's time to get rid of this. She's also just constantly worried that like she's going to die and the family's going to find this, or at some point someone's going to find it. Um, and at the end of the book, I want to read this. She's talking about Marina, her, Ricardo's soon to be wife, who's pregnant now, and the relationship between her and Marina. And she says, she'll understand, meaning Marina, I'm sure, because all women hide a black notebook, a forbidden diary, and they all have to destroy it. Now I wonder where I've been more sincere, in these pages or in the actions I've performed, those which will leave an image of me, like a beautiful portrait. I don't know. No one will ever know. I feel myself drying up. My arms are branches of a dead tree. I try to become old, and maybe I only became mean. I'm afraid. Marina could persuade the others to come home early to surprise me. I have to burn the notebook as soon as possible, right away. I can't even reread it and risk softening. I can't say farewell. This will be the last page. On the following pages, I won't write, and my future days will be like those pages, white, smooth, cold. The big white stone on which, in the end, I will return to being called Valeria will be smooth. She was a saint. Ricardo will say to Marina, sobbing, as Michael said to me of his mother, and she won't be able to deny it. She'll know nothing of all that I felt and lived in these months. In a few minutes, there will be no trace. Only a faint odor of burning will linger in the air. So there's this, illusion, or this sense in which, she has to just uphold this image of this saintly woman who's never thought about being with any other man and all this stuff, instead of her family cannot see these inner thoughts, these inner feelings that are so real, they're so human. It's like, why can't they, it sucks that I can't be myself and be honest about what's going on. Instead, I have to pretend and let my son pretend that I'm this saint of a woman so that he can keep this story going generation to generation. So I encourage you, check this book out. There's a lot to learn here. There's a lot to reflect on. There's a lot to discuss. I mean, this would be a great book for a discussion with several people. Um, and so let me know what you think. Like, comment, and subscribe. And I hope to see you at another discussion.